Welcome to Books and Bridges, everyone. It's great to be back with another engaging topic and scholar. In this community of hearts and minds, we look for wisdom, intelligence, inspiration, beauty, and profundity wherever we can find it, across time and tradition, throughout civilizations and cultures. And we have a lot of fun in the process. On this, the eve of Christian Holy Week, we return to the ancient world and look deeper into the words and experiences of the early believers in Jesus of Nazareth. Before Christianity became the largest religion in the world, before its teachings and ethics sunk into many of our modern assumptions about charity, about human rights, a ragtag group of Jews and Gentiles scattered across the Roman Empire were anything but mainstream. So how did this small sect rise up to conquer an empire? Tonight, we will examine some of the first writings and individuals who helped put that mosaic together. Books and Bridges is a 501c3 nonprofit public humanities institute of ideas and conversation. We provide a space for civil and searching discourse. I'm your host, Nathan Nielsen, and our guest is Jason Robert Combs. Dr. Combs is an assistant professor of ancient scripture at Brigham Young University. He joined the faculty in 2016 after working as a lecturer at High Point University, Guilford College, and UNC Greensboro in North Carolina. Combs earned his bachelor's degree in Near Eastern Studies from BYU. He holds master's degrees in biblical studies from Yale Divinity School and in classics from Columbia University. He earned his PhD in religious studies with an emphasis on the history of early Christianity from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I have to say that's a very impressive bio.
Thanks.
So during our discussion, feel free to ask questions via the chat button. And Dr. Combs, the floor is all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Give me just a minute to figure out how to share the screen here, and then we'll get going. There we are. Okay. Can you see that all right?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. So I was invited to give this lecture on Christianity since we're coming up on the Easter season, and I thought it would be so. A lot of people have written on the topic of how Christianity grew from a small Galilean Jewish sect to an empire-wide religion over the history of the Roman Empire. And so I thought it would be fun tonight to explore that a little bit from the perspective of early Christians. Early Christians were aware of their growth, of their rapid growth as a small sect growing in the Roman Empire. And they had some of their own insights into why and how that growth occurred. So I want to describe a little bit about the rise of Christianity in their own words tonight. I think we could begin just by acknowledging that people were attracted to Christianity in the ancient world for a lot of the same reasons people are attracted to Christianity today. I'm thinking in particular of early Christian in the early 2nd century. So now more than 70 years, about 100 years, in fact, after Jesus' death, there's a Christian named Justin who comes to be known as Justin Martyr because he dies as a martyr for Christianity. And in one of his writings, he describes his experience joining the church, joining Christianity. He describes it in a really interesting way. He describes it as a journey through philosophy. He talks about how he came to this point in his life where he desired to seek after truth. And so first he aligned himself with a group of philosophers known as Stoic philosophy. And after spending some time with them, felt that he wasn't quite getting the answers he needed. And so then he sought after another kind of philosophy. He went to the Peripatetics and then to the Pythagoreans. Eventually, he found his way to the Platonists. And he thought, aha, now I've got it. Now I found truth. And in his own words, he describes himself as expecting to look upon the face of God at any minute through his Platonic practices of meditation. In fact, one day while Justin was working on meditating and reflecting on life and on the purpose of life, he's wandering sort of out by the seashore, where he thought he could find some space to be alone and reflect on things. And while he is out there, he's surprised to encounter another person. Apparently, there were usually no other people out there. He encounters another person who he describes as an elderly gentleman, who's sort of staring at Justin, and Justin's sort of surprised, says, "Why are you looking at me like that?" And they strike up a conversation. And this man says he's out looking for some lost members of his household. But they strike up a conversation, and he starts asking Justin about what he is doing. And Justin explains a little bit about his journey through philosophy, and that he is pondering the meaning of life, essentially. And this man begins to ask him some questions about what it is that now his Platonic philosophy gives him. How does it help him to live a happy and joyous life? And at first, Justin is able to give him some answers, but then it gets to a point where Justin doesn't quite have the answer. And at that point, the old man begins to share with him some of his own views about the meaning of life. Turns out this old man is a Christian. And as he shares with Justin the things that he has come to believe as a Christian, Justin's heart is touched. In fact, in Justin's own words, here's how he puts it. He says, "My heart was immediately set on fire, and an affection for the prophets and for those who are friends of Christ took hold of me. While I was pondering on his words, I discovered that this was the only sure and useful philosophy: becoming a Christian, enjoying a happy life." And so this story of conversion could sound quite familiar. It could sound like a story of conversion today, where somebody goes not from one philosophy to another, but from one church to another, and finally finds meaning in one particular faith tradition, right? But the question that we're reflecting on tonight is not just a question of how conversions happened, but a question of how conversions happened to the degree that they happened, how Christianity grew so quickly. It's a little bit difficult to estimate just how quickly Christianity grew, because we don't have many people counting. We don't get in early Christian writings a lot of instances where we get estimates. We get right around the year 200, there's a Christian named Tertullian living in a city called Carthage, on the north shore of Africa, modern day Tunisia. And he comments that Christianity is now the majority of the Roman Empire. That doesn't seem to be quite accurate from what we know from other writings in the time. So Christians weren't always that good at calculating the actual numbers, and didn't often provide us actual numbers. As with Tertullian, he just says, we're now in the majority. Scholars have tried to estimate the growth of Christianity. And here's one example of a chart. This is a chart just estimating the growth of Christianity at a constant growth rate from the year 40 to the year 350 CE, estimating at 3.35 growth per year. Now, this is not how organizations tend to grow. They tend not to grow in a straight line like that. Growth tends to look a little more like that, a little more like a curve, with exponential growth occurring year by year. So the numbers that this scholar here, Keith Hopkins, provides may not be precise, especially towards the middle there. But this is the best we can do, giving rough estimates. If we were to be a little more conservative with our numbers, we might say that maybe around the time that Paul dies, maybe right around 64 CE, according to tradition, Paul and Peter both die under the Roman Emperor Nero. That's just tradition, but let's talk about numbers right around the time of that the Emperor Nero does in fact kill some Christians. So right around 64 CE. If we're being really conservative, maybe there are only 1,000 to 2,000 Christians then. If we jump forward then to the time of Tertullian, who I mentioned just a minute ago, by that time, right around 200 CE, maybe there's 150,000 or so. Jumping forward again to 250, this is the time of another major persecution of Christians under the Emperor Decius. This persecution only lasts about a year, fortunately. Decius dies in 251 CE. But by that time, there might be about 500,000 Christians. By the time of just before the Emperor Constantine, just before Christianity becomes one of the official religions of Rome, or a legal religion of Rome, by that time, we're getting into the millions now. We're at about maybe 3 million Christians by the time of a major persecution just before Constantine. So just based on the assumption that Christianity continues to grow exponentially, these numbers should not be too surprising. But it wasn't a given that Christianity would grow at this rate. So how do Christians, once the numbers do start to increase, once the numbers start to increase to the point that an emperor like Decius in 250 CE takes notice and says, we've got to do something, the way that what Emperor Decius did is he enacted a decree saying everyone has to sacrifice to his image, to the image of Decius. And so Christians across the empire had to decide how they would manage this. Would they actually offer this sacrifice, or was that conflicting with their faithfulness to Christ? A lot of Christians thought, no, we can't do that, and decided to face death rather than offer a sacrifice to this emperor. It's right around that time, right before that time, that a Christian named Tertullian suggests that martyrdom itself, Christians' willingness to die for the faith, may in fact be one of the things that is drawing attention to Christianity and causing the growth of Christianity. So moving forward, what I want to do is reflect a little on Tertullian's insight that Christian growth was occurring through martyrdom, and then the insight of Christians from the time of Acts to the time of another Christian right around 250, right around the time of Decius, named Origen, who suggests that Christianity was growing because of miracles. So these are the two things I'm going to focus on tonight: martyrdom and miracles. Martyrdom starts quite early. In the book of Acts, where we get the famous story of the first Christian martyr, a Christian named Stephen, that happens in Jerusalem. The first time that we get an example of direct Roman persecution of Christians in a very dramatic way happens under the Emperor Nero. I mentioned this just a minute ago. According to some Christian traditions, Nero is responsible for the death of both Paul and Peter. But according to the Roman historian Tacitus, Nero is definitely responsible for the death of a group of Christians who were living in Rome, because Nero blamed those Christians for a fire that took place in Rome. This fire, by the way, is part of, well, is where the saying Nero fiddled while Rome burned came from. Nero wasn't in Rome when this huge fire broke out. It burnt it burnt a whole number of apartment complexes, a whole portion of Rome right next to Nero's palace. Nero happened to be up at a villa, so he could see the smoke from there. But rumor started to spread that Nero himself had set this fire, or had somebody set the fire for him, because right after this fire laid waste to a whole series of apartment complexes next to his palace, he expanded his palace right into that area. So people were suspicious that Nero might have had this fire set himself. So to push the blame off to somebody else, Nero fastened the guilt, as Tacitus says, and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Nero, or Tacitus goes on to explain a little more about how people responded to this act. He also describes what Nero actually did. It's quite horrific. Some Christians he used as torches for a party. You can see that displayed in this artist's representation of Nero's persecution here. So some Christians were used to light the party as torches. Other Christians were used as the entertainment. According to Tacitus, he wrapped raw animal skins to some Christians and then set some wild, hungry dogs to chase after them and eat them. So this was quite brutal. And according to Tacitus, the people who were there watching this responded with some compassion. They were not overly impressed. Not everybody was overly impressed by Nero's actions. For Tacitus, Tacitus puts it like this. He says, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there rose a feeling of compassion. And he goes on to suggest that people realized that this was not necessarily being done for the public good, but for Nero to satisfy his own cruelty. As Tacitus was describing these horrific acts, he also says a little bit about what he knows about Christianity. And it's sort of interesting and may, in fact, give us some insight into how some people viewed the spread of Christianity in these early days. Again, this is only 64 AD, CE. This is very early on. And Tacitus is only writing 50 years after that. And he summarizes how Christianity grew like this. He says, he describes Christians, the origin of the name Christians is being derived from the name Christus, or Christ. And he says that he describes a little about the life of Christ, that he suffered a penalty of death during the reign of Tiberius Caesar under Pontius Pilate. And then he goes on to describe Christianity as a mischievous superstition, and says that by killing Christ, this mischievous superstition was checked for the moment, but then describes it as breaking out again, anew, in Judea. And then, this is quite interesting, he suggests that when it comes to Rome, and he sort of is not surprised by this because he describes Rome as being a place where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. And that's not far off. While I may not agree with his caricature of Christianity as hideous and shameful, the idea of lots of different things coming to Rome and finding their center and becoming popular really isn't that far off. People in Rome were fascinated by foreign beliefs. In this same time period, Other cults from other parts of the Roman Empire were also becoming quite popular. The cult of Isis from Egypt was becoming quite popular. The cult of Mithras that had come from Persia was becoming quite popular. So Christianity could have been seen by some Romans as a fascinating foreign religious system or philosophy, as Justin put it, that could give them new insights that otherwise would not be available in Rome.
Jason, may I ask a question at this point?
Please.
Do you think Christians conceived of themselves as a church in the way that we think of church, with membership, with structure, organization, or was it more like a system or a way of life?
That's a really good question. The way we tend to think about church today has a lot to do with our notions of separation of church and state. Today, we think of church as being one thing, and we think of culture as being something else, and politics as being something else. And in this time period, there was no separation of church and state. So one's cultural background, one's ethnicity, one's religious beliefs and politics were all bound up together in very complicated ways. And truth is, even today, they are, even though we might like to suggest that there is a definitive separation between church and state and other things. Yeah, good, very good. So yes, most people would have seen Christianity as being sort of foreign and different. And Christians, in fact, in this period, describe themselves, one of the ways they describe themselves as being a new race. Judaism is one race and paganism is another race, the Greek and Roman race, and Christianity is a third race, a new race. So it's really interesting the ways in which Christians describe themselves and the way other people describe themselves in this time period. Yeah, thank you. Really good. Jumping forward now to the time of Tertullian. Tertullian, in writing, this is from Tertullian's Apology. He's writing a defense of Christianity, and he addresses Roman governors head on in what he says here. In fact, he begins by saying, go on, Roman governors, go ahead, continue what you're doing, persecuting Christians. If you think that's going to make you more popular with the mob, please go ahead. And then he goes on and says this: yet no cruelty of yours profits you in the least, but is rather an attraction to our own sect. For the more you mow us down, the more in number we grow. The blood of Christians is seed. Sometimes that's expanded in the translation. People translate as the blood of Christians is the seed of the church. The idea is that martyrdom itself was leading to growth in the church. Now, that may sound kind of counterintuitive, but if you think about it, as people are attending these public executions, and as Christians are being given the chance to deny that they are Christians, and they are refusing, that could arouse interest in people that are watching. Not interest in following them to death, but interest at least in wondering, why is it that these Christians are refusing to say, I'm not, or refusing to deny Christ in order to save their own lives? In this same period, just before Tertullian writes this, there is a Christian living in the same city as Tertullian, a Christian named Perpetua, who only recently converted to Christianity. She was a young mother, only recently married as well, and she is arrested for being a Christian. And in a work called The Martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas, most of that work is written in the style of a journal, and perhaps may include some of Perpetua's own thoughts. It may be in part her journal. And she describes her experience being in prison. And on one day, she describes her father coming to visit her, and her father's not a Christian. He's begging her to deny that she is a Christian. And And what does she point to? Hold on. She points to something that's right next to her. I happen to have the text with me right here. I'm trying to remember what it is she gestures towards. She might gesture towards a chair or something like that. And, oh, yes, hold on. I just found it. A water pot. She says, do you see this vase here, for example, or a water pot or whatever? And her father responds, yes, I do. And she says to him, could it be called by any other name than what it is? And he says, no. And she responds, well, so too I cannot be called by anything other than what I am, a Christian. And so we have these examples of Christians taking this definitive stance and affirming their beliefs in the face of both torture and death. Let me say something briefly about the role that miracles played in the development and spread of early Christianity, and then I'll wrap things up and we can take some time to answer some questions. From the beginning of Christianity, in the book of Acts tells stories of lots of miracles. In fact, it's hard to, if Acts, I'm referring to the book of Acts found in the New Testament today, it's hard to turn a page in that book without seeing another account of the miraculous. And Christians continued to tell stories throughout the early history of the miraculous things that happened in the early days of the church. I have here an image of the day of Pentecost, where, according to the book of Acts, the Spirit descends upon the 12 apostles, and they begin to speak in other languages recognized by all the people who had come to Jerusalem to attend for the Feast of Pentecost. And they hear the gospel being preached in their own languages, and they're fascinated and want to learn more. And according to Acts, this event leads to a bunch of people joining the church. After going forward into the 2nd, 3rd century and beyond, Christians continued to write books of Acts, including not only acts of martyrdom, such as the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas that I mentioned a moment ago, but also acts of the early apostles to tell other stories of the apostles' journeys throughout the world and the miraculous events that occurred around them. They also, in other writings, included insights into how miracles influence the growth of Christianity. By the late 2nd century, Christianity had grown enough that some pagan philosophers, some non-Christian, non-Jewish philosophers had started to take notice. A philosopher named Celsus, wrote a whole treatise called, I'm forgetting the title now. It's usually translated as On True Doctrine. And the whole treatise is a direct attack on Christianity. He had found somebody who was Jewish, who told him about Christianity, and it was sort of his informant. And he apparently had read some Christian literature, and he produces a very lengthy treatise attacking Christianity and showing how the whole Christian tradition is preposterous. Jump forward a few decades, you get another Christian named Origen of Alexandria, who picks up this work by Celsus and goes through it point by point, refuting him on every step of the way. One of Celsus's critiques was not that Christianity claimed that miracles occurred, but he critiqued Christianity for having untrustworthy witnesses of miracles. For instance, he critiqued the tradition of women viewing Jesus's resurrection. Women, according to the Gospels, were some of the first witnesses to Jesus having been raised from the dead. And he critiqued them as being hysterical women who were probably hallucinating out of grief. That's what Celsus said. And so Origen goes through and refutes this and points out other people who have seen Christ raised from the dead. And Origen also takes on some of Celsus's cherished religious traditions as well. Celsus boasts of how even though we should be skeptical of these Christian women who claim to have seen Jesus, nobody should be skeptical of all of the pagans who have seen the god Asclepius, because you can go to an Asclepian temple today and ask for a healing to occur, and the god Asclepius will appear to you in a vision at night, and you will be healed. And of course, there were accounts of that very sort of thing happening in this time period. Well, Origen responds to that, suggesting that the sort of miracles that happened in the early days of the church had not ceased. In fact, here's one of the things that Origen comments. He says, many, suggesting throughout time, even in his own day, many have been converted to Christianity as if against their will, by some sort of spirit having suddenly transformed their minds from a hatred of the doctrine to a readiness to die in its defense, having appeared to them either in a waking vision or in a dream of night. By spirit here, he's referring either to the Holy Spirit or to angels, suggesting that people are having these visionary experiences, and that is part of what is leading them to Christianity. One of the advantages Origen implies in his writing is that you don't have to go to a specific temple of Asclepius to have a positive experience with God. God can send an angel to you as a Christian wherever you live. You don't have to journey to some distant temple to receive this special blessing. God can come to you. And so that was part of Origen's argument for these miracles. So I've gone just a little bit over my allotted 30 minutes, but that's okay. I'll save the rest of time for us to discuss a little bit more of your interests in the rise of Christianity. And so I'm happy to talk more about any of the issues that I've addressed directly here, or anything else that you may be interested in the period of early Christians. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Combs. Very illuminating context and history that you lay out for us. We do have a couple of questions so far. One from Bradley Kramer. Actually, Bradley is a pretty good scholar of Judaism, and so he knows a lot about this topic. He asks, when do you think Christianity became predominantly non-Jewish?
That's a really good question, and also one that's really difficult to answer. It's difficult to answer for a number of reasons. One, because of how we define Christianity and Judaism. So I would first have to ask, what do you mean by Jewish? So here's what I'm thinking. The reason I'm hesitant is because even as late as the 4th century and after, we have, I'm thinking, for instance, of John Chrysostom, late 4th century, very upset at Christians who were spending their time attending Jewish festivals and attending Sabbath services regularly. And he thinks that is a horrible thing to do. Well, the fact that is still happening in the 4th century suggests that there are Christians who feel a very close connection to Judaism that late. How do we define whether those Christians should be considered only Christian or Jewish, or in what way, is complicated. We can definitely say that very early on in the history of Christianity, even in the writings of Paul, Paul is noticing that he is experiencing a lot of success among Gentiles. And even in his letters, for instance, in Romans 11, Paul is already reflecting on what's going on. He's asking himself, Paul himself is a Jew, he's asking himself, why is it that Gentiles seem to be receiving my message in greater numbers than my fellow Jews? And Paul suggests that the answer is that this is all part of God's plan, that this is that for the moment, Gentiles should come into Christianity in greater numbers so that one day they may, in turn, save the Jews. That's how Paul phrases it so that all Jews will be saved in the end, that God will not forget his covenant people. That's how Paul frames it in Romans 11 and then 12. So that suggests that very early on, there are more people coming into Christianity from not from Judaism, but are coming in from outside of Judaism. But those Christians and how they self-identify and how they understand their relationship to Judaism as the centuries go on remains complicated. What I'm saying is, somebody like Justin Martyr says that Christians are the true Israel. And if you were to ask somebody, a non-Christian Jew in that time, they would say, no, you absolutely are not true Israel. We are true Israel. So, yeah, it's complicated. I'm not sure I answered your question at all, but there you have it.
And that gets into the whole question of supersessionism.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and some Christians definitely, Justin in saying we are true Israel, those who do not accept Christ are not, is definitely a form of supersessionism.
Now we have a question from John Tanner. How much of the growth of Christianity into a world religion is based on the principle of cuius regio, ius religio after the conversion of Constantine? I'm not sure if I pronounced those correctly or not.
So after the conversion of Constantine, Constantine was not the emperor who declared Christianity the one and only religion of Rome. Constantine ended the persecution that started under a previous emperor, under Diocletian, and made Christianity a legal religion. But it wasn't until 50 years later, right around the year 380, that it was the Emperor Theodosius that in the Edict of Thessalonica declared Christianity the official religion of Rome. In the period following that, and even in some ways before, there was definitely advantages to being Christian. Some people after that point, as Christianity and Roman imperial politics merged more, there were advantages to being a bishop in a particular town, political advantages now. And so there were absolutely some people who converted to Christianity in that time period for political reasons. At the same time, in that time period, there were some Christian acts of violence against Jews and against pagans because they won, because Christianity was now the official religion. And they believed that there were some Christians who believed that with their new power, they should use it to make sure that Christianity spread by any means. And so there are instances of Christians burning down synagogues, and then other Christians saying, well, we should rebuild, and then the Roman emperor saying, well, okay, maybe you should rebuild, and then other Christians being mad at the Roman emperor for suggesting they should rebuild a synagogue. So it's a complicated political time. But yes, conversion to Christianity is absolutely influenced to a degree in that time period by it being the imperial religion. It's hard to say statistically if how different the numbers would be if Christianity had not become the predominant religion. If I think I'm still displaying my chart here, or my PowerPoint. So if I were to go back to this graph, I'm not a numbers person. I don't do statistics, but just knowing a little something about exponential growth, I think we can assume that Christianity would indeed have continued to grow in large numbers at that point. Once they passed that million Christian mark, things continued to grow fast. By the way, this doesn't mean that all Christians, that Christianity was one thing at this time and that all Christians agreed. Christianity was growing fast, but it was also growing in diversity too. And that began very early on. So I hope that addresses your question. Nathan, I think you may be seeing questions that I'm not seeing, and I might be seeing some that you are not. I see a question from Brian Christensen and one from Mark Hurst, but I haven't seen the others that you mentioned.
Well,
So,
yeah, I don't see those. Let me just follow up on John Tanner's question real fast.
Yeah.
And we can get to the other questions later. And that is, do you think that, so you've basically established that the conversion of Constantine provided a pretty big bump in prominence and even, membership of Christians. But do you think that trend had that trend already been established, and was it already moving in the direction of prominence before that conversion?
Yes. So it's hard to really say how much Constantine's conversion factored into the continual growth of Christianity. It absolutely helped that he established such things as the Council of Nicaea. That allowed all Christians, not all, but allowed a number of Christians across the empire to meet in a way that they had not been able to prior to having that kind of political backing. So those sorts of things help Christianity.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
then definitely under the Emperor Theodosius, once he declares Christianity the official religion of Rome, that absolutely had an impact. Yeah.
That was cementing.
Yeah.
And to follow up on what you said before about there being a small season of a sort of kind of a triumphalist vindication or vengeance that the Christians carried out against the other Romans. Franz Nielsen asked this question: can you explain a little bit about the first Christian armies? About what time period was that? Any ideas on that?
I can't. That's beyond my time.
Would that be considered an army, though, that initial kind of retribution that you talked about?
Yeah, that wasn't armies. That was mobs. That was mob violence that was tearing down temples and things.
So armies, would that be more like medieval period?
Yeah, crusades are what come to mind when you say armies, and that is medieval period. And yeah,
Okay.
I am not a specialist in that time period.
1000, 1100, 1200 CE. Yeah. So I think what's happening is, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so the two questions I'm seeing here are one from Mark Hurst.
What's happening is that some are asking through Q&A and some are asking through chat.
Oh, okay.
And you can ask either way, I think.
I see. So I'm seeing I've got my chat box open, so I'm seeing the chat questions.
Yeah, now I see them. Go ahead and answer them. In fact, if you want to just, while you answer these questions, it's just to unshare the PowerPoint.
Yeah, sure. I can turn that off now.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, so Mark Hurst asked if I could comment on Tertullian's introduction of the doctrine of the Trinity and whether it was controversial at the outset. Yeah, controversial to some, certainly. Tertullian introduces the word Trinity. He is often attributed as being the Christian who coined that term for a description of deity in Christianity, a description of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. He coined the term in the context of a debate. So it was controversial in that regard. He coined the term in a debate against a person or group of people that could be called modalists. So there was a group of people who believed that the Bible makes it very clear that God is one. The Bible also talks about Jesus Christ, God the Father, and the Holy Spirit as if they are three separate personages. And so some Christians, the one that Tertullian's arguing against is a Christian named Praxeas, some Christians insisted that for God the Father to be sovereign, there cannot be any other gods. There must be only one God. And so they insisted that God the Father, that there is one God, and that one God sometimes took on the characteristics or the personality or the mode of the Father, at other times took on the mode of the Son, and at other times the mode of the Holy Spirit, so that there was actually only one God who appeared at different times in different modes. So this is called modalism. And by Orthodox Christian standards, this was declared a heresy. Tertullian takes an Orthodox position and argues against that and says, absolutely not. There is not just one person who is sometimes Father, sometimes Son, and sometimes Holy Spirit, but rather there is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, three separate persons who are one God. And to describe this triunity, he adopts the term Trinity. And so that's where the idea comes from. For Tertullian, he is not fully orthodox by later standards. By the time you get to the Nicene Council, the whole debate that leads to the Nicene Council is a debate about the status of God the Father's Trinity or God the Father's divinity in comparison to the Son's divinity. Is the Father greater than the Son? Tertullian would have said, yeah. Tertullian had no problem with that idea, that the Father was greater than the Son. The Nicene Council, what they conclude is no, the Son must be just as divine as the Father. There's not a distinction between their level of divinity or their divineness, their divine essence. So, yeah, great question, Mark. I've also have one from Brian Christensen here that's saying, don't look at the previous one. So I'm not going to look at the previous question. I'm going to look at this one. Okay. Were the writings of Paul, which predate the four Gospels, read by the writers of the four Gospels? Do you believe that Paul's epistles influence what's written in the four Gospels? That's not something that I have spent a whole lot of time studying myself. I'm aware of a really interesting article by Joel Marcus, a professor who was at Duke University, he's now retired. He wrote a fascinating article on Paul's influence on the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is our earliest gospel, and Joel, who wrote a whole commentary on the Gospel of Mark, is convinced that Mark was familiar with some of Paul's letters and that they did influence the writing of the Gospel of Mark. So that's the best I can offer you, Brian. I have not studied that enough myself to have a definitive answer for you.
Well, I actually have another question to ask, if you don't mind.
Please.
It seems to me like, based on what Tertullian is writing about how the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church.
Yeah.
And a lot of what Paul writes about, the wisdom of the world is foolishness unto God. And Paul even calls himself a slave before God. It seems to me that Christianity, one of its kind of particular geniuses was that it overturned the power balance of just the whole way that the Roman world looked at what constitutes power, and it it flipped it in a way that it turned the defenseless and the weak and the meek and the humble, those who kind of endure for Christ's sake, as holding the real power instead of those who hold the dominant physical power. Do you think that explains some of the particular appeal, the mass appeal of Christianity at that time?
That's hard to say. It's hard to say in terms of how that either did or did not affect the numbers or affect the appeal. Here's what I can say. I can say that very early on, some people did critique Christianity for appealing to the poor and the lower classes. They suggested that it's not. It was a common caricature of Christianity to say the only people who are converting to this crazy religion are the poor and the uneducated. I don't know how much weight to give to that critique, because people made the same critique of other religious systems of the time, suggesting that it was a common way of disparaging a particular religious system, saying, oh yeah, only poor and uneducated people would be interested in that. That said, it is absolutely part of early Christian theology to suggest that there is value in things that the Roman Empire did not place value in, right? From the idea of a crucified Messiah, idea of the savior of Christians being somebody who was killed in a horrific way by the imperial power, and suggesting that through that act, Christ had performed a salvific work, a work that had saved people. The book of Acts that I mentioned a moment ago, the book that is found in the New Testament today, that Acts, there's part, I think it's around chapter 17 or so, where a group of non-Christians is complaining about what Paul and other Christians are doing. And they characterize it as they are turning the world upside down. And there's something that really rings true to that when you read the book of Acts. It is constantly suggesting this sort of reversal of assumptions that Acts is written as a triumph of Christianity, but it ends with Paul as a prisoner in Rome preaching this triumph, preaching that we won. And there's this deep irony there that a lot of Christians found beautiful as well. Of course, Christ's message that it is the meek or the poor who will inherit the earth is something that Christians continue to come back to and to preach. So, yeah, there is an appeal there. Later on, of course, once Christians do become more wealthy, they then have to grapple with how to make the message work in that new context. And sometimes they did it by changing interpretations of what it meant to be poor. They would favor the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew that says poor in spirit over the Sermon on the Plain in Luke that just says blessed are the poor.
Well, I actually see a question from Catherine Taylor.
Hi, Catherine.
Is she one of your colleagues? I think she is.
Yeah. She works at the Maxwell Institute here at
that's right.
University.
Thanks, Catherine, for asking. She says, you mentioned the various so-called pagan religions that take hold within the Roman Empire. Can you say a little more about the earliest variety of Christianities that take hold in the empire, especially within regional communities around Rome?
Yeah. So that's also complicated for a number of reasons, because the writings that survive are often the writings of the winners, right? So, for instance, there is a variety of Christianity that sometimes we mistakenly group all together today and refer to as Gnostic Christianity, but there were a variety of Christians that we could apply that title to. And for a long time, we thought that we knew everything there was to know about these Gnostic Christians based on the writings of Christians like Irenaeus of Lyon, who wrote of how sexually deviant these Christians were and all the problems that these Christians had. It wasn't until just before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, in fact, right around 1947, that in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, a whole cache of texts were uncovered that were texts that belonged to a group that could be called Gnostic Christians. And we learned from those texts that Irenaeus was right in some of his descriptions of Gnostic beliefs, but totally wrong in some of his caricatures of them. This group in particular was absolutely not sexually deviant. In fact, most of them were abstinent and were vowing to live lives of chastity. So one of the challenges with knowing things about regional varieties of Christianity is what has survived to today. Had we not discovered those Nag Hammadi codices, those Nag Hammadi books years ago, we would still not know a whole lot about one of the many varieties that existed at that time. Now, having said that, we also know that there were varieties of belief that also seemed to live somewhat in harmony. There were Christians who, I mentioned Tertullian a little bit ago. Tertullian, in some of his documents, begins to quote people who later Christians referred to as Montanists, as a heretical sect called Montanism. And Tertullian quotes these people as if it's normal. This is a group that really strongly valued prophecy. They believed that God had not stopped speaking to Christians, and that there were still prophets who received the message or further light knowledge directly from God, even in the time of Tertullian. And Tertullian quotes some of these some of these Montanist or New Prophecy prophets who live in Asia Minor, in modern day Turkey. Tertullian, again, north coast of Africa, in modern day Tunisia. And there's no indication that Tertullian left Christianity and joined Montanism, as some scholars once thought. In fact, it seems like Tertullian had pretty much normal Christian beliefs and attended church with other Christians, and yet also believed in some specific Christian prophets who other Christians might not have believed in at the time. And so there were varieties even within a congregation of Christians at the time. So I'm not sure that really gets to Catherine's question. But that's all I've got for you for now.
Yeah, thanks. I think it does. One thing about any kind of organization of human beings, there will always be variety.
Yeah,
it just proliferates, and it's the burden of the organization to kind of bring some kind of uniformity to that.
Absolutely. And for a long time, that was really difficult within Christianity, because they had spread out throughout an empire that was often hostile to Christianity as a cult. Not that there were often large empire-wide persecutions. That didn't happen until much later. But it really wasn't possible for Christian leaders throughout the empire to get together and decide on sort of a standard Christian message until after Constantine. That's part of what the Council of Nicaea was all about.
Well, on that note, this will probably be our last question from Brian. He said, when and to what degree did Platonism influence early Christian concepts of God? In particular, did it affect concepts of whether God is embodied or whether God exists within or outside of his created universe?
Very good. Yeah. So, there were definitely some Christians who valued Platonism as a way of thinking, using the best knowledge and thought of the day to try and understand their own scripture. Justin Martyr, I mentioned, was a follower of Platonism before he converted to Christianity. And you can still see hints of that in some of his writings. Later on, somebody like Origen of Alexandria, who I also mentioned, also loves Platonic thought. But for Origen, he always made it really clear that philosophy should be, his term was the handmaiden to theology. You should never put the thought of the world ahead of Christian truth and scripture. So Platonism absolutely was part of the conversation that Christians were having. But Platonism was not the only type of philosophy that influenced the kinds of conversations Christians were having. I mentioned, we've talked a little bit about Tertullian. Tertullian really favored the philosophy of Stoicism. And so Tertullian, for instance, he feels very strongly that God has a body. And to make that argument, he relies on the philosophy of Stoicism. Origen thinks that God does not have a body. And in making his arguments, he says things that sound very much like Platonism. So Christian thought, whether you were arguing that God had a body or that God did not have a body, Christians relied on the best thought that was available in their day to try and make those arguments. The challenge, of course, for these Christians is when you turn to Scripture to ask those questions, it can be really challenging to find a definitive answer. There are absolutely passages of Scripture that describe, in Exodus, for instance, that describe God as having a face or having a back. There are passages in Psalms that describe God as having wings and feathers. There's a passage in Isaiah that describes God as if he were a giant, where he's sitting in the heavens and resting his feet on the earth as his footstool. And so Christians were always stuck trying to figure out which of these passages are we going to take literally and which of these are metaphorical and figurative. And oftentimes they had to rely on other insights to try and make that determination. Sometimes those insights were from philosophy, sometimes from Platonism, sometimes from Stoicism. Sometimes they would rely on other scriptures to try and make the determination. But on an issue such as whether God has a body or not, there is no scripture that early Christians had access to that said definitively God has a body. And so all they could do was try and decide what is metaphor and what is literal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. This has been a great discussion. I think what it's shown, among many other things, is that Christians were human beings who were, as Paul says, seeing through a glass darkly.
Yeah.
And they were finding their way theologically, just like we all do. And I think you've given us a great presentation that helps us understand the Christian beginnings and roots much better. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
And so that will conclude our discussion tonight. I just do want to also say that later in the year, the dates have not been solidified, but Books and Bridges will hold a discussion series about the great ethical systems of the world, the great, schools of ethical thought. So, thoughts like Confucianism, Upanishads, Stoicism, Platonic thought, Aristotelian, Nicomachean ethics, even perhaps Christian and Jewish ethics, just to give us a sense for what are the pedigrees of some of our own ethical systems, and maybe how ethics might differ from something like Revelation in a scriptural sense. So that will be coming later this year. And oh, gee, there's one more question. Mark Hurst says, thank you very much. That was fascinating. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And thank you very much, Dr. Combs. And we will see you next time. Goodbye.
Great. Thanks a lot.